Great. So let's start. Let me start by saying good morning, good afternoon, good evening for all of you, because I know that you are joining for every corner of the globe. My name is Miguel Ballester. I'm product management lead, and once in a while, I give a helping hand to our brand team to increase the awareness of our programs, our activities, and products as well. And today is all about material sourcing and sourcing them to drive positive change and turn such material value into real human welfare and environmental gain. But we have a very, very tight agenda, so let me get into it in a minute. But first of all, I really want to give a very, very warm welcome to our speakers today. So I will just change slides so that you also see their faces. 1 second, there's a lot to do at the same time. So I will just mention your names, and if you can just quickly say hi, just so that the audience sees you. So we have Rashad Abelson, who is joining us from the OECD as a legal expert for the Responsible Minerals Implementation Program.
Hello, everyone.
Rashad, hey, hello, how are you? We have Leah Butler joining us from the Responsible Minerals Initiative. She's the VP of Responsible Sourcing.
Hi, everyone.
Hello, Leah. We also have Baukia Tiwas from Solidaridad Europe as the head of policy influencing.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon.
Nice. Hello, Baukia. We also have Ashton Carter. He's the CEO and trustee from the Impact Facility and the CEO of TDI Sustainability.
Hi there. Afternoon. Good morning, everybody.
We have Marcus Reuter, who is senior expert in recycling and metallurgy at the SMS Group.
Good day, everybody. Nice to be back again. Thank you.
And we have Shreya Gul joining us from the ILO as a head. There has been a little bit of a change, so I don't know your title, so maybe you want to say your title yourself.
Yes, hello everyone. This is Shreya. I'm a technical officer specializing in e-waste from the ILO. Nice to be with you all.
Great. Thank you. So let's move on. So as I said, we have a tight agenda. We will start. So these are not the only speakers. These are, I wanted to give a warm welcome to our external speakers. But we will also have today two of our colleagues at Fairphone, Monique Lempers, who is the Impact Innovation Director, and Tirsa Foss, also from the same team. They will introduce themselves also in a second. But we will have today different blocks. We will start with an introduction. Then we will move, so introduction by Monique and Rashad and Leah. Then we will move into a presentation of our fair material sourcing roadmap at Fairphone that will be done by Tirsa. Then we will break out a little bit for questions. So that's when you guys can ask all your questions. I will remind you the housekeeping rules in a second. Then we will have two blocks, one on responsible mining, which will be around 20 minutes, including the questions as well. So after this block, we will have another Q&A in between, and then we will have the responsible recycling block also at the end with Q&A. So without any further ado, let's move on to Monique Lempers. Monique, are you with us?
Yeah, no, of course. Hi, Monique Lempers. I probably know quite some of you and met you over the years working on this topic. And I also probably haven't met a lot of you either. And I hope to be able to do so in the future, physically, preferably. I'm the director of the Impact Innovation team within Fairphone. I've had also other roles before, commercial director and value chain team director. So I've, in essence, been from different roles and responsibilities, really driving the impact agenda mainly, and also the business case behind impact at Fairphone over the last 5.5 years. Yeah, shall I continue? So I'm actually really excited to kick off this special conference and also honored as a first speaker. I'll keep it short though, because we have a lot of speakers to listen to. But I'm really happy that we still have these opportunities to come together as a collective movement. That's the way I see it, because we all are driving the same impact agenda, I think, but from our different angles and responsibilities. Today we're focusing on fair material sourcing, a topic that lies really at the heart and foundation of Fairphone's existence, as it was already 10 years ago, actually, literally it was February 2011, when the first fact-finding mission took place by Fairphone's founder Bas van Abel, which were actually cobalt mines in the DRC. At that time, Fairphone wasn't even a company yet. We were still an awareness-raising campaign on conflict minerals. But with the conviction of that we would be able to even better address the systemic issues behind the malpractices by being part of the system, with that conviction, we turned into a company by 2013. And we had a clear mission then, which we still have now, and that is by establishing a market for ethical electronics, we motivate the industry to act more responsible. And this is really what still drives us at Fairphone every day. So if you can go to the next slide, yeah. So our approach to make this happen is threefold. On the one hand, we raise awareness by uncovering this complex supply chain behind our phone, and by communicating transparently about what the challenges are, what the findings are, and doing that also to a quite broad audience. Setting the example by innovating on scalable solutions to those malpractices, and also by selling smartphones that are ethical and commercially successful. And thirdly, by motivating the broader industry to make caring for people and planet a standard part of doing business. And we apply this approach to every aspect of our company and phone, from design to manufacturing, to reuse and to recycling. So all the different steps in the life cycle of the phone. And when it comes to our key impact strategy for Fairphone, it's all about making the most out of the materials that are used in our products. So we really, with a focus on designing our phones to last as long as possible, emphasizing the need to reuse and recycle, and then the topic we are here for today, sourcing our materials in a fairer way. Next slide, yeah. So for Fairphone, fair sourcing means using market demand as a catalyst for positive change. And seeking opportunities to drive impact, and so it's really about impact management and seeking opportunities where we can make a difference, and it's not about risk management or avoiding risks. Not saying that that's not important, but beyond that, it's really the impact making that we're focused on, and how we base our strategy on. And this means then also setting up or joining collective industry efforts to create continuous improvement interventions, because we know we won't change the world overnight, but that we can make a difference step by step. And if we do that collectively and transparently and holistically, we also are able to do that at a broader system-wide level. And in this, using market demand as a catalyst for impact is probably what stands out most, and what we hope to see shifting in the industry as well. And that together we move from indeed that risk to impact management, we believe that this is really critical to address the challenges that are ahead of us, as within an increasing demand for fair virgin or urban mined materials. The investments that are needed to make that happen, to make the mining of these materials more responsible, is really significant. But can be done and can be triggered, but they can only be triggered, we believe, if we ask for it and if we invest in it really as a whole industry. So we need to demand for fairer materials, and where we can support and co-invest in making it fairer. We can't do that by ourselves, and that's why we will have you all here today as well. So thanks for listening to this introduction, and I look forward to the speakers.
Thank you, Monique. Thank you so much for your words. We'll move on to Rashad Abelson. Are you there?
Yes, yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure, yes. Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me to kick off what I'm sure will be a great round of presentations and discussion by this panel. As our moderator said, I'm from the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct, where an intergovernmental organization tasked with developing government-backed standards on business behavior, and in particular on today's topic of discussion, which is responsible sourcing and supply chain due diligence. If I can jump to the next slide and the one after that, please. Thanks. There we go. I was told by Fairphone that most of our attendees today are already generally familiar with the OECD guidance for responsible mineral supply chains. Just as a quick refresher and to help set the scene a little, allow me to go over some basics before jumping into the broader state of play on responsible sourcing globally. So these are government-backed recommendations on how businesses can identify, prevent, mitigate negative impacts in their own operations and throughout their supply chains. The guidance is directed at all companies in the minerals sector, from miners, large and small, to exporters, refiners, smelters, all the way down to the final product manufacturers and retailers. And very importantly, it covers all mineral supply chains. So not just tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold, the 3TG, it covers all mineral supply chains. The approach recommended in the guidance isn't really like the typical compliance approach that companies might be used to. And that's because the objective of this tool is to promote responsible investment and responsible engagement in conflict-affected and high-risk areas in order to drive change and impact, as Monique said earlier. What we'd like to avoid seeing is de-risking through disengagement from those areas. And I hope that difference is clear. So this guidance provides companies with a framework to continue engaging transparently with mining communities through progressive improvements to manage risks over time. Can I get the next slide, please? Really quickly, this slide shows the evolution of the OECD's implementation program over the years and how the issue has evolved since the guidance was adopted in 2011. Our role as the OECD Secretariat is to promote widespread adoption and use of the guidance. As you can see, the initial focus was on 3TG from Central Africa. Since then, we've expanded our outreach efforts to include stakeholders from other geographies like China, Colombia, West Africa, and India, to name a few, and also to other mineral supply chains. So now specifically, we're working on cobalt and copper, but we have outreach with a number of other mineral supply chains. Cobalt and copper, where we've seen probably the most significant company uptake outside of 3TG already. Can you get the next slide? So while the guidance is a voluntary set of recommendations, it has been made into a legal requirement or a market requirement globally for a number of mineral supply chains. And this trend is only increasing and is probably one of the biggest drivers to push company uptake. What this map shows is countries in blue that have integrated the OECD guidance into their legal requirements for certain companies. In the US, for example, it's all publicly listed companies sourcing 3TG from Central Africa. And in the EU, it's for importers of 3TG, but from any high-risk area. So despite the limited company scope of this legislation, the cascading whole of supply chain approach to the guidance actually results in the legislation having extremely far-reaching effects. So what that means is, large downstream companies in the US trying to comply with the US law, the Dodd-Frank Act, end up cascading that requirement to their thousands of suppliers all over the world. And then those suppliers cascade it down further if the due diligence is being conducted effectively. And then in green on this map, you have countries that have publicly endorsed or committed to supporting implementation of the guidance in some form, but where the requirements themselves might still be voluntary. And then yellow finally is where you have countries where industry standards have been adopted, requiring members of those industry bodies to demonstrate implementation of the guidance, which is often through regular audits of their management systems. Those market requirements are a massive driver for company uptake as well. Now you can change. There you go. So beyond the minerals world specifically, governments are also increasingly adopting more general non-sector specific supply chain due diligence legislation. And that will also have massive implications for businesses and for the vulnerable communities who are probably affected by these negative impacts. These most recent legislative developments, which are listed on the left-hand side of your screen, are being prompted by studies commissioned in the EU and the Netherlands and Germany and Norway, which show lack of uptake of voluntary standards and the need for stronger monitoring and enforcement of company efforts. So that's what's driving the increase in legislation. Now, obviously, legal requirements won't be happening in a vacuum. Governments and other organizations like the OECD are supplementing government enforcement and legal requirements with support mechanisms. So that includes funding, training, capacity building, and tools development, both for the companies in the jurisdictions where laws are being passed, but also the companies in regions where the risks might be required to be mitigated. And so it's important to support both ends of the supply chain there. Can I have the next slide? Great. So looking back over the last 10 years in terms of main achievements of this implementation program, we have seen stronger adoption of due diligence standards in producing, processing, and consuming countries. We have seen stronger buy-in from the private sector, leading to more alignment around the OECD standard and a coherent international standard, and including in supply chains beyond 3TG. And the Fairphone scoping study, which reviewed, I think, 38 minerals, but you'll be talking about that in a second, is I think, a great example of how companies are taking this increased scope more diligent or more seriously, even though existing legislation only covers 3TG. So that's really important to highlight. And then likewise, we've seen responsible sourcing programs start to develop in mica, coal, steel, colored gemstones, copper, and cobalt, just to name a few. And then finally, yes, we've seen increased global awareness of the need to engage with artisanal mining in particular, in order to kind of really harness the positive potential for business for sustainable development in those mining communities, rather than de-risking or replacing mine material with recycled material in order to avoid having to conduct the same level of due diligence. So we see that greater understanding now. And can I have the final slide? Yes, great. So these are the remaining challenges that we've observed. Well, we still need to have more meaningful, detailed public reporting on due diligence efforts. This is one of the requirements of the guidance. And while there is kind of broader application of the guidance in terms of what companies are reporting that they're doing, we could use more meaningful, detailed reporting. And that's at all tiers of the supply chain, not just the more consumer-facing companies at the downstream end. We need to see more support channeled to smaller supply chain actors, particularly in the upstream, where significant resources are needed on their part to combat some of the most serious supply chain risks. And then finally, we need to combat demand in due diligence-free supply chains, or supply chains that haven't been adequately scrutinized, and then see stronger law enforcement efforts on minerals-related crime. So we essentially want to make it normal to do business responsibly and costly to do business irresponsibly without supply chain due diligence, which is kind of a reversing of some of the existing incentives that we've seen over the last 10 years. And so, yeah, that's it from me on the state of play of responsible sourcing. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your presentation. We will move on to Leah Butler, if you're there.
Great. Hi, everyone.
Hi, the floor is yours. Thanks for being with us.
Fantastic. Nice to be here and to follow on from Monique and Rashad's presentation. My name is Leah Butler. I lead the Responsible Business Alliance's activities related to responsible production, sourcing of minerals writ large, and really help companies and our stakeholders with meeting some of those challenges, addressing challenges, and driving positive impact across multiple tiers of the supply chain. With that, I've been asked to talk about why conducting a scoping and prioritization exercise is important, such as the one that Fairphone has engaged in. And the role of not just the electronics industries, but broader industries in kind of driving this impact forward, both from a due diligence standpoint, as well as impact on the ground. And this is speaking a little bit to those points Monique made around the systemic change, bringing companies together and industries together, using broad-based frameworks and aligned approaches really to leverage the power of the market to shift supply chains and improve performance, improve awareness, and really drive positive social economic impacts all the way down into mining communities. So we'll take the next slide. So just a little bit about the RMI and kind of building on this sort of multi-industry approach is this concept of really bringing together many different parts of the supply chains, both large-scale producers, traders, smelters and refiners, as well as first, second, third tier manufacturing companies, all the way to consumer-facing brands to get that cascading effect that Rashad spoke to as well. We know it takes a full supply chain approach, and to help align and focus our efforts, we really base everything we do around core international expectations, rooting, of course, in the OECD due diligence guidance. Next slide. Rashad spoke a little bit to these drivers, but these evolve over time. And we look really at the calls for not only increased disclosures around due diligence and positive impact, but improvements in the quality of these disclosures, how companies are addressing potential negative impacts, as well as looking at from a risk perspective, improving operating practices, and really working kind of leapfrogging the supply chain really to work directly in different mining communities as well. And so we look at NGO, CSO, government, regulatory drivers as really supporting our efforts, and then trying to use that to find efficient solutions to not just the regulatory needs, but also company priorities, and making sure that they're able to address this broad swath of mineral issues, as well as environmental, social, and governance aspects of mineral supply chains. Next slide. So how do we do this? And really, what is the role, for example, of an organization like the RMI in this? Is really looking at the need for companies to not only identify those relevant materials for their own operations, to understand them, and then prioritize to create that positive change. So of course, to do this, data is incredibly important. Having credible data that's accessible, that's updated, that's aligned with platforms that are broadly used, so that comparisons can be made and investments can be made in how to address particular issues in different commodity supply chains, knowing that they're not all the same. And this would be important for just understanding those unique risk and opportunity sets that can then trigger collective action. And I'll get to that more a little bit later on in the presentation. Next slide. So what minerals, what issues? I think we've heard already from the speakers around, it's not just about 3TG conflict minerals, which remain crucially important, and cobalt and copper. But, many companies are putting out there, really, it's the periodic table. How do we really understand what issues are affiliated with these commodities, what's relevant for those supply chains? And so to help with this, we've worked with partners at Drive Sustainability and TDI Sustainability around looking and mapping common materials in the automotive and electronic supply chains, also understanding what issues are relevant for those supply chains, and then that can help drive that collective action. And so this is really an iterative effort that we're hoping to also build on very excitedly this year through taking a static material change report that we published in 2018 and putting it into an online interactive platform called Material Insights that we'll be happy to launch and pleased to launch mid-year this year. So we'll be talking more about that as part of an OECD side session towards the end of April. But the important thing here is this is evolving. And so this information is not static, but these supply chains do shift. And so our understanding and company understanding of these issues also evolves. Next slide. In terms of the RMI's approach to this, really helping companies wherever they are in the value chain identify and prioritize the salient social and environmental impacts of extraction of these different commodities. We really take that foundational step of helping provide the basic steps for prioritization and understanding, providing those tools, but it does not really replace the need for companies to take individual action to map their supply chains, understand their supply chains, and then work on that engagement and that collective approach and that action. So this is sort of a really, really important foundation, I think, where collective efforts can be really helpful to pool resources. Next slide. In terms of the process we see companies go through and that we help facilitate as well as, identification of the raw materials, helping with that sensing and research, looking at ways to engage, looking at different partnerships, consortiums and associations, or assurance systems that can help with address the root cause issues, and then identifying opportunities for collective action, like pooled funding or investment projects that really help drive change on the ground. Next slide. But this is not something that a company does in isolation, or even one part of a company does in isolation in terms of procurement or responsible sourcing. This really does take a lot of sensing and working across cross-functional teams, looking at R&D and engineering, product design, leveraging data for different components. And so it is very iterative and dynamic. We were just speaking with one of our member companies yesterday about some of the complexities of batteries in their supply chains and in their components, and really some of the nuances with materials engaged and how they engage with suppliers on battery commodities, considering the upcoming battery regulation outside of the EU. Next slide. Then we also look at, and this is just a couple of examples of ways to prioritize engagement and ways to prioritize commodities and materials, looking at volume, looking at high-risk context, looking at where there is the greatest adverse impacts in terms of environment and human rights, looking at the ability to remediate and leverage the power of the market and collective platforms, and then looking at legislation that can also help drive a focus on a particular issue that may make it easier to make change within the supply chain. And then once these issues are identified, and we can go to the next slide, there's that collective approach, which is companies individually needing to map their supply chains, and this is a cobalt example, facilitate those step 4 audits that the OECD articulates, address risks, publish information, but then there's all of the work around engaging on best practices, supporting local communities, looking at how to share and disseminate tools. That's also really critical to driving lasting impact and also increasing the number of companies that are conducting these efforts. Next slide. And just very quickly, some of the positive impact, Fairphone asked me to talk about the impact that we see is the uptake over time. Just very quickly, you can see from 2010 on conflict minerals to where we are now, the uptake in due diligence at certain parts of the supply chain, the addition of cobalt in 2018, and I think we can project that there will be more colors added to this graph over time as different commodities are added, copper, lithium, etc. So this is some of that change just visualized. Next slide. And I'll not hammer on this, but Rashad did talk about the importance of improving public disclosures and the quality of those disclosures. And that's something we can see and try to be transparent about in terms of assessment audit reports, due diligence reports, and supply chain policies that you can find in terms of different commodities that are for conformant smelters and refiners. So monitoring progress in these disclosures over time. Another positive impact we see in the next slide is how this helps drive continual improvement. This is always due diligence as an ongoing process, is not a one-time thing. So looking at the fact that many companies struggle with the same core issues, what's important is driving that progress over time, creating the framework for that to happen, monitoring it, and then disclosing and being public about where companies stand or where a particular industry stands around an issue, whether it's an environmental issue or maybe it's a social or human rights issue. Next slide. And then there's a number of results in terms of impact on the ground. I won't get into this in a lot of detail, but you can see here some of the recent reports, even recent as March of this year, areas with due diligence programs in terms of mining communities having less interference with armed forces, increased government presence, greater signs of economic well-being, and really there's a need to continue this work on looking at what is the impact of due diligence systems and the work, for example, that Fairphone is doing within mining communities. So my last slide, and I'll leave it at that, is just looking ahead a little bit in terms of where the industry is going collectively, is taking a minerals agnostic approach, really looking at the broad swath of commodities where we need to continue to map and conduct due diligence, addressing a full swath of ESG issues, including different tiers of the supply chain, not just smelters and refiners, and starting to supplement assessments with other non-auditing approaches. So happy to share these thoughts with you, and I'll hand it back to the moderator.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I think we will move on now. We are a little bit behind schedule, but we will take, I think, one question from the audience. I see a couple of questions that are also addressed to Fairphone, so I will leave those for a little bit later as well with the presentation of Tirza. I'll get into Camilla's question, which is to Rashad. She says, you've raised a significant uptake of the OECD guidelines for companies and states in recent years. How do you see the remediation step of the due diligence process in mineral supply chains? Is it also improving? Do you consider companies have been adopting effective grievance mechanisms to remediate adverse impacts on their supply chains? What about states? Are they also taking proper steps to remediate those harms? It is specifically addressed to Rashad, but of course, other speakers feel free to contribute.
Yeah, maybe my co-panelists can speak more to the steps companies are doing to implement remediation mechanisms within their own supply chains. So, for example, whistleblower mechanisms and complaint mechanisms. From the government perspective, we have this mechanism known as the National Contact Point, which was established under the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. It's a commitment by governments to create an office requiring that handles non-judicial disputes of potential violations of the OECD M&E guidelines. So that includes, violations of human rights and due diligence obligations from companies. The NCPs have been handling more and more cases in the last 10 years. They have been increasing their activity, but they remain generally underfunded in most OECD governments. We have a few standouts, a few governments that are growing their NCP offices and handling a lot more interesting and complex cases, not just in the mineral sector, but across different sectors. But in general, it still remains a rather underfunded office. And so more needs to be done in terms of governments to meet their commitments to provide adequate NCP offices, yeah. And I don't know if anyone wants to speak on the private sector side of what they're seeing in terms of remediation.
No? Okay, thanks for that answer. I will just take one more and then we will move on. There's somebody asking also for Leah. Maybe if you take us already to the first steps, if for a new company that is really trying to address this, there's a question around how could companies engage with organizations that are further away from their own company, for example, mines, what could they do to start?
Sure. With that, I think there's...
Oh. Excuse me, that was me, wrong button.
That's okay. With that, I think there are some tools to leverage, not just to engage perhaps the first, second, and third tiers of your supply chains, but really contacting directly with those mines. So assuming you know which mine sites are within your supply chain, which is maybe a first step of the process, is that direct engagement to communicate expectations, support opportunities, encouragement as well in that company's responsible production or sourcing journey. So through associations, for example, where we provide some basic resources to help with that direct outreach. So it's, I think, both about communicating to more direct tiers of the supply chain where you have more leverage, but then not stopping there, but actually doing direct contact both to smelters, refiners, processors, and then the industrial mines.
Thank you for that. I see, as I said, like some questions for Fairphone. Monique, do you mind if we move on? And then in the next Q&A, we take the Fairphone questions? Great, then we can do that all together. Then let's move on. It is my pleasure also to introduce you to Tirsa Vos, one of our colleagues. Tirsa, are you there?
Yes, hi everyone.
Great. Do you mind introducing yourself?
Yes, I'm indeed part of the Impact Innovation team at Fairphone, responsible for the materials and mining programs. So the topic we are discussing today, so really pleased to continue indeed discussing after having heard about the introduction from Rashad and Leah on where we are, where we come from in terms of mineral sourcing and where we could go. And that's something I've been working on the past few months as well, looking at next steps that we can take as Fairphone. So I'll just continue there indeed, really starting with our long-term vision. When we look at material sourcing, what is it? And ultimately we envision a world in which we are truly circular, where materials can be used and reused and recycled to the fullest extent possible, and where we don't need to rely so much on mining, but that is not the reality that we are in today. So what our goal ultimately then is creating a fair transition to a circular economy, having that long-term circular world in mind, but recognizing that it does require a transition to get there. And that requires multiple interventions, as you can see on the slide as well. And we also do so as Fairphone, and we focus on longevity, longer use of products. We have also a modular design, so phones that are easier to repair and to upgrade over time. But of course, recycled materials is also part of the circular economy and really more the topic of sourcing that we have today. So if we look at recycled materials, you see an increasing uptake and also increasing demand for having recycled materials. At the same time, only 17.4% in 2019 from all the e-waste was actually collected and recycled. So that's a small part of materials that is coming back for recycling. And then if you take this small percentage, not even 100% of that we can take back. As you can imagine, if it's a product, if it's e-waste, it's a complex combination of different materials, and we'll hear more on that as well. So an even smaller percentage is what we get back. And that leaves the mining sector still an important source of supply for the materials that we need. And not just from that perspective, from a supply perspective, but we also look at it from an important sector generally, providing a livelihood for millions of people around the globe, and also really supporting and driving, contributing to local economies. So definitely a sector to consider as well in this fair transition to a circular economy. So that as a very long-term vision in mind, then looking at how could we focus, what could we do, and we defined basically focus opportunities for change. So the so-called thought leadership areas are the areas where we see we as an industry need to take more action, and we also recognize that a positive change or positive impact could be created. So looking at material sourcing, not just as we said from a risk perspective, but looking at that very broad landscape and what it is in the material landscape, how could we focus on opportunities for positive change and impact? And that covers both recycling and mining. So we have defined 4 areas where we see this opportunity. In recycled, we see that in both developing scalable post-consumer recycled chains, as well as looking at fair urban mining. For mining, particularly, it's the small-scale, artisanal and small-scale mining sector that's often associated with many risks, but where we see an opportunity to drive towards fair sourcing solutions and responsible supply chains, as well as looking at large-scale mining and large-scale mining engagement, particularly also for community impact and development. And we'll hear more on all these 4 topics with experts speakers following later in this webinar as well, that give some context and also examples of what this looks like and what the current state of affairs is. So if you go to the next slide, then as Leah said, we need to prioritize, we need to focus, and how do we do so? We need a lot of data. So Leah just introduced how that could work and what companies need to go through. And this is an assessment we did for Fairphone in 2017. and defined where we would focus now. And it was in 2020 the year to look ahead again and define what materials we now could and should be focusing on. And we did that looking at which material chains our sector, so really the electronic sector at large, can but also needs to influence. So what are the material chains that are creating or showing a critical need for improvement, but also an opportunity. So if you, so the selection criteria initially, from going from a very, very long list of over 450 materials that we looked at, was to look at whether materials are critical to smartphones, whether they actually are in our supply chain, of course, to be able to change it, but most importantly also whether the electronic sector at large is taking a significant share of the demand for these materials, because that means that we as an industry have the leverage as well as opportunity to influence. And then, of course, for which materials this is most relevant. So we looked at the social, environmental, and governance associated issues and risks in those supply chains. And from a very long list of materials, we brought that down through these selection criteria to 17 materials. And that's where indeed a lot of data came in. We did look at the available reports we did earlier, as Leah also mentioned, the Drive Sustainability and TDI Sustainability report of material change, as well as more recent available data. So I think, and this is a difficult exercise, so the more we would have there and recent as well, the more we could also streamline those strategies. As a next step, we deep dived on the next slide into the 70 materials that were left, and also really to look a little bit more closer at what now really the issues are in those material chains, and to be more concrete in defining our problem statement, but also to look at both recycling and mining and what could be a potential strategy there, recognizing that often both could be responsible mining as well as responsibly recycled are sometimes needed, but where do we see an urgency and an opportunity to change? Looking at the demand growth for the upcoming years, if there is an exponential growth in demands is expected, which is the case also for a lot of materials for the green energy transition, that might put even higher pressure on, for example, the mining sector, still needing to supply that material. The depletion rates of some of the materials were considered, as well as the current mining sector dependency. And that led us ultimately to a selection of 14 focus materials, those materials where we see an urgent need as well as an opportunity to change. And those are listed here in the slide, and they're, as you can see, spread across the different components in our phone. If you go to the next slide, you see that our roadmap does include strategies that both talk about recycled materials as well as mined materials. Ideally, you would have probably per material a strategy that fits both, because both are often still needed. Operationally, that's not always possible, nor really from an impact and resource perspective always desirable. So we made our choices and to focus for some materials on the recycled chains, whereas for others on mine. And as you can see from the list, some of these materials are new for us as Fairphone, new in scope, but some of them we have, of course, previously worked on. As Monique said, we started years ago with awareness raising campaign on conflict minerals, and since it has, the fair material sourcing has been an important part of Fairphone's mission and work. So for some of those materials, it's also really taking that next step, seeing where the industry is coming from. As Rashad has also said, over time, we see an increasing uptake, but also see that there are still issues remaining. So whereas we might have addressed conflict for some of those minerals, there are still a lot of health and safety working conditions to be tackled. So that is just a practical example, for example, for tin of tungsten, where we have integrated conflict-free tin before in our supply chain, but we're really looking also for how can we take that next step, coming back to our fair sourcing principle of continuous improvement, to looking at increasingly creating fairer and responsible uptake. We have, as I said, already have some efforts in this field. So I just want to give two examples of what we have been working on these past few years of what we think we could and others could be looking into when you discuss fair material sourcing and driving change, positive change through your practices. One of those examples is the Fair Cobalt Alliance. That's an alliance and an action platform that we launched last year together with numerous partners, really as an effort to drive the responsible ASM cobalt sector in the DRC, ensuring an increasingly gets uptake for responsible artisanal and small-scale mining practices, both on the sites where you could consider improved working conditions, health and safety, but also surrounding those. So the root causes of some of these issues, especially also child labor, are often also related to community development issues, access to education, for example. So we also look at community efforts around child labor remediation, as well as economic diversification for the communities surrounding those artisanal and small-scale mining sites. Another example is related to gold. We have integrated fair trade certified gold in our supply chain already for a couple of years as the first electronics company, and to date still the only one with fair trade certified gold. So we are really working with the Fair Trade Foundation into seeing also how other brands could take this up and also include fair trade gold in their supply chain. At the same time, we see that that's not just taking the certified material in our chain, we think is not enough. That's really requesting the mine sites to be already at the highest possible, best possible level. And that's often not where they are. So we also engage in a project, the Lake Victoria Gold Program, where we work together with numerous partners into supporting mine sites to improve their practices so that there will over time be an increasing number of mine sites being able to improve their practices and ultimately, hopefully at some point, reach that same best practice standard as fair trade gold has. So those are just two examples of material sourcing efforts we have been doing over time, and there's plenty of more, but we also, and therefore the roadmap, have many materials where we're still working at. Now you can definitely go to the next slide, because this is nice as in terms of a story and an ambition that we have. But it's not just that. It's not just an ambition we have on paper. It's actually something we have also set measurable targets for, also inside the company as one of our key performance indicators. And that reads that what we have with the objective to have 70% of those 14 focus materials ultimately sustainably sourced by 2023. Ultimately, of course, with the impact goal to have increasing number of people benefiting from these responsible supply chains and contributing to the SDGs as you see them on the slide. And I want to be ahead of the question, why not 100%? Because I think that's also where we need to acknowledge that these materials are really spread in so many different components and parts of the phone. They're reaching, and we measure that by weight, reaching 100% is really also not feasible and nor really desirable from the effort that needs to be taken into account to tackle every single and often very small parts of the phone. If you go then to the next slide. Yeah, kind of having set the targets, knowing now our ambition and having shared with you how we got to the selection of the focus materials, we are of course on this journey of making that work and getting towards ultimately our goal. And that's not always an easy one. We have, of course, a couple of years of experience already doing so. And the picture that you can see on the slide kind of shows how that feels. That often feels sometimes getting back to start like a board game, or having to go into different loops and iterations of negotiations with suppliers, taking lessons learned of programs and initiatives. So it's definitely a journey that has its ups and downs. It's certainly also not a journey we can do alone. It's a journey that we need to do together with many other partners. So we're happy to share with you today our way forward, and hope that many of you would like to partner and work together with us so that we could have fair sourcing, driving positive change, where together we scale the solutions that already work, but also where we don't have them yet, try and innovate and be creative to find new ones. And I'll leave it there and see what questions come up, Miguel.
Yeah, thank you, Tirza, for the lovely presentation. I'm going to invite, of course, Monique, but also the other speakers if they also want to contribute to answers. But the first one is specifically about Fairphone. So Sarah is asking, Fairphone is pioneer in ethical sourcing, but aren't other phone manufacturers sourcing in similar ethical manners? How does your company exactly stands out from others? Who wants to take it?
Yeah, I could take it. Yeah, I could take it. No, and I think that's great news. Many of us indeed in the industry are trying different ways and working on solutions, as Leah said, collectively through the responsible initiatives and other initiatives, as well as individually. Where we do stand out, I think really that Monique introduced from the beginning, that perspective of not just doing it from a risk and compliance perspective, checking the boxes that we need to do, but really looking much more beyond into seeing where the change could be, even systemic change, what role we could have, even as a very downstream brand, into being part of that change. That's something is core to us. And I think increasingly brands do so. So I think it's actually a very good point and a very positive note that the others are going in this direction too. And indeed, individually as well as collectively. I don't know if you have additions, Monique, from your perspective.
I think that was a very well explanation. Yeah, no, I think it's maybe to just add that indeed we really see also our role to pioneer and innovate there where we see we can again bring it to a next level with regard to either the scope or the impact that we can make, and yeah, really inspire others to collaborate. So we're not taking it from a perspective of oh, we do it better or less than others, but we really want to collaborate and motivate others to join and see where the opportunities are, but also share the vision on where we can go towards with others so that we can do that together.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll move on to one question from Richard. He says, beside mining and extraction, is Fairphone also involved in the minerals transformation industry, for example, by putting in place or assessing new standards with the rest of the downstream supply chain, or supporting EU-based recycling and processing companies? Who wants to take that one?
Yeah, I think for different materials, for us the strategy could be different. They're really also different in its problems and also in where we as Fairphone think we could contribute to the solution. For some of it, and also in our take-back programs and recycling initiatives that we have, it does definitely entail looking and working with recycling and processing companies. We do look at standards, or standards on the level of mine sites. Of course, also through our membership with the Responsible Minerals Initiative, as Leah said, working at what industry accepted or global standards look like. So we do engage on those initiatives, and it depends a little bit on the material to what extent we see most opportunity for Fairphone to engage in terms of its expertise that we have.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we will continue if that's okay. There's a lot of questions, but I prefer to continue now with presentations and then maybe have a longer Q&A towards the end. So we will move on to the block of responsible mining. And I want to give a very warm welcome again to Baukia. Baukia, are you there with us?
Yes, definitely. I'm here.
Great. Can you introduce yourself, and the floor is yours, so you can continue also with your presentation after I will be changing the slides.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute here on these important topics. So my name is Baukia Theeuwes. I work for Solidaridad in the Europe office. We're an international NGO, a global network organization. Most of our offices are in the global south, in producer countries, where we work on sustainable and inclusive supply chains for different commodity groups. And one of our programs is on ASM gold, and that is what I will be focusing on as well here today, but we also work in agricultural commodities next to mining. Next slide, please. Can you go one back? Because, yeah, otherwise you'll be distracted by the numbers that I'm going to show you on the next slide. What I wanted to do is to actually here at the beginning of my presentation, share with you my key message that I have for you today. And I'll explain in the other slides how I come to that key message, but let me start with the key message. My key message is that the idea of a sudden and complete shift to recycled materials is a fairy tale. This was also the conclusion drawn by Fairphone in the research, and I couldn't agree more. In the long interim period towards full circularity that still remains, it's crucial that we invest in the development of a responsible ASM mining sector. And the speakers before me also said it. Rashad called it enable investment and trade. Monique referred to it as using the buying power. So I think we can quickly agree on that, on the need to invest in responsible ASM mining and also to create demand from the downstream side, electronics, but also other sectors. Now, next slide, please, with the numbers on artisanal and small-scale mining, ASM. I'm not sure to what extent the people in this webinar are familiar with the ASM sector, so I thought maybe to give you a little bit of statistics on that. After agriculture, mining is actually the second largest employer in the world. It's a huge sector. And the estimates are that about 150 million people depend on ASM across 80 different countries, mainly in the global south. Up to half of the ASM workforce, it differs per country, but are women. So you might typically think of a very strong man going down into the mine pits, but also a lot of women working in mining. The majority of small-scale miners, of ASM miners, work in the informal sector. So they typically do not have the necessary licenses or permits, but they have been mining in that area maybe for generations already, but they have not been formalized. Now, for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to zoom into gold, as I said, and it's good to understand that for gold, about 2/3 of the gold supply comes from mines, mine production, and 1/3 comes from recycling. Next slide, please. If we look at the volumes, we see an interesting development. Now, this slide shows the change in volume between newly mined and recycled gold. It's a bit of a complicated graph, but basically what you see here is the forecasted developments on the right-hand side, the graph on the right side, between 2019 and 2024. The orange block shows that the volume, it's the gray block shows that the volume of newly mined gold is actually expected to increase with 145 tons, and the orange block, the 360 tons, shows that the volume of recycled gold that comes available on the market is actually expected to decrease. Now, simply put, that means that the total gold production for gold is expected to decrease due to smaller volumes from recycling. Next slide, please. let's take a brief look at the gold price. Well, as you can see here, it's currently at a record high. It has increased, yeah, a lot, and with that, also the number of ASM gold miners has gone up impressively to these estimated 20 million ASM gold miners worldwide. We do not really expect this picture to change anytime soon. Of course, I'm not going to predict anything on the gold price, but yeah, we believe that the number of ASM miners is not quickly going to go down. So bottom line is, due to these record high gold prices combined with decreasing volumes forecasted on recycled gold, we strongly believe that ASM mining will continue and it will provide a livelihood for millions of people in the global south. Next slide, please. Yeah, the previous one, the picture. What you see here is a group of female miners using basic tools and basic processes separate the gold. It's a typical picture of a ASM mine in Africa. For those of you that have had the chance to visit such a mine, you will recognize it. It's pretty basic, you could say. These mines, they face a wide range of social and environmental challenges, or often referred to as risks. We didn't really mention them in this webinar, but for gold, obviously it's mercury pollution, poisoning as well, health and safety issues, including accidents, fatal accidents, corruption, smuggling, violence, including sexual and gender-based violence, child labor, land degradation, etc. Now, the good news is that the greatest opportunity for the industry to generate a positive economic, social, and environmental impact in these challenging ASM mines is by supporting the ASM mines and the ASM sector. It's a huge development opportunity for many miners and also for many countries in the global south, in Africa, South America, and Asia. And downstream industry can play a really crucial role in this by sourcing ASM gold, by buying it, allowing it into international supply chains, creating demand, and also by investing in improvements in ASM mines. Now, the bad news is that if this support for ASM mining from international industry, from downstream industry, electronics, but also jewelry and other sectors is missing, the ASM miners, and if ASM miners continue to be ignored, it will be impossible to realize a responsible ASM sector. This will not stop the miners, but it will make it so much more difficult to improve practices and impacts of this sector. Next slide, please. Solidaridad, together with many other actors, is actually quite concerned that the focus on circularity might come at the cost of attention and development of the ASM sector. What you see here is a call to action that we launched with different stakeholders last year in October in reaction to a big jewelry brand. The jewelry company very proudly announced a new sustainability strategy for their company to fully close material loops. The key message of the call to action, for which I showed the screenshot here, is that when companies do this and they choose 100% recycled gold, they are actually disengaging from really urgent needs of the ASM sector. So we call on the industry to have a dual sourcing strategy. like Fairphone also concludes in the report. It was signed by a range of different organizations, different NGOs, but also industry organizations, which is of course crucial in this. RJC, LBMA are two of them. Next slide, please. Now, then, what do we need to get there? What do we need to come to a responsible ASM sector? Now, I think I need to speed up, so I will be very short on this one, won't go into details, but as was said already, for the downstream side, the international industry, the two most important things are basically to create incentives for responsibly produced ASM gold, and next to that also to invest, to increase know-how, technology, equipment, access to finance, etc. And with that, I go to my last slide, which is again a photo. This time you see a man working in an ASM mine, again in Africa. And I'm actually quite concerned that what is most needed for these miners, which is investment for development, might actually become more difficult to achieve for two reasons. The first reason is the focus on circularity that comes at the cost of the focus on ASM. Well, I talked about that. The second one, and I didn't talk about that one yet, is that companies might disengage due to new and existing due diligence legislation. And like Rashad explained, these do not at all discourage or prohibit sourcing from ASM, but when companies opt for what I call the lazy approach, they will disengage from ASM because it's simply the easiest way to de-risk supply chains. And that's not only the case for ASM, we see it happening in other sectors as well. So smallholder cocoa farmers, for example, or smallholder palm oil farmers, they all are at risk to lose access to international markets in favor of large-scale producers, which are easier to control, but actually generate little revenue and development for those who need it most, for miners and also for the producer countries. Banning ASM gold from international supply chains in favor of recycled gold or in favor of large-scale mined gold, that will not end the human rights abuses and environmental destruction. Instead, it will further drive miners into informal markets and worsening conditions. Now, let me be very clear. I have nothing at all against moving to a circular economy. To the contrary, but we should not allow this to happen at the cost of the miners, the communities, and their environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bauke, for that those last words. Thank you. We are a little bit over time, so we will continue. Thanks so much for the presentation. We will move to the next speaker, who is Ashton. Are you there with us? Can you introduce yourself and start your presentation? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm Ashton Carter, and I'm CEO of TDI Sustainability, which is a risk and supply chain responsible supply chain company, and also the CEO of the Impact Facility for Sustainable Mining Communities, which is a hybrid non-profit and impact investing vehicle working in mining communities in Africa. If you go to the first slide, please. Actually go to the second slide. My slide's a little bit random. I think this slide's mostly to show our deep love for Fairphone, but we've heard a lot today about the due diligence and the market for due diligence services such as compliance audits and transparency programs and grievance mechanisms is expected to come in just shy of about $3 billion over the next 5 years. Which is great for TDI sustainability. And as we've heard earlier, this is a responsibility and a legal obligation, soon to be very far reaching with new EU regulation coming in. And it's important to complete due diligence and continue monitoring of supply chains. Yet a risk-based due diligence approach alone has limits in its effectiveness in addressing problems upstream in supply chains. So while it's appropriate and effective in identifying the negative aspects of activity around mining, for example, it's less well suited to identifying the opportunities to mitigate problems, and in particular, the systemic root of those problems. So what should this opportunity be, and how should businesses go about contributing to it becoming a reality? The first thing I think is important is that rather than look at mining through the lens of risk due diligence, an exercise that can often conclude that mining is something we need to find a way to avoid, just as we've heard previously, and therefore exclude the very communities that need a lift in the first place. If we take a moment and look at it through a socio-economic development lens, we instead find a strong case for engaging and allocating resources to programs that can advance development in the communities around mining projects. And because these also address the root cause of human rights environmental problems that companies are concerned with in the first place, such as poverty, they also simultaneously address the environmental, social governance and corporate reputation risk that is so important in the due diligence. If you go to the next, as you skip 2 slides, yes, that's perfect. That slide is just the right one. Let's go back, that's good. So to make this point, let's first look at where mining takes place. So what I've done in this slide here is pull out the most mining dependent countries globally, and then overlay those with vulnerable communities, in this case, with those areas that are most exposed to the effects of climate change. And what I hope to illustrate here, that in many places where mining happens, there are few other economic choices. And by that, I mean choices of earning a livelihood. So we believe, therefore, that there's an imperative here to figure out how to ensure that these communities can have an experience of mining that is positive and establishes a strong economic base for the future, rather than exclude them from economic opportunities, which sometimes due diligence and risk-based approaches can trigger. So what could that be? Next slide, please. So if we look at large-scale industrial mining in particular, and we look at employment, for example, it's not a great employer relatively. And many employees at mining sites are highly skilled, sometimes in specific technologies, and they come from overseas. However, rather than measure the development opportunity, the potential of mining through direct jobs of large-scale mines, what we should really be doing is looking to include in our analysis the communities around mining projects. And here's us where we find the true opportunity. You look at the bottom left-hand slide there, you'll see that the multiplier effects of mining are outsized compared to other industries in rural economies, such as agriculture. And much of that value comes from procurement in the local economy. And if you look at it like that, then the multiplier is anywhere between 8 times and 20 times. So that means that every dollar you spend in the local economy multiplies 20 times in terms of benefits for the communities around the mine. So that's a very significant thing. And there's another point to remember about mining as well, that it is a temporary activity. So mines last in 25 years to 50 years, some potentially go up to 100, but as we increase the productivity, less and less do they last that long. So essentially what we have here then is a window of opportunity to invest in and around mineral development and bolster those local communities. And this isn't just the case for large-scale mining, this is also the case for artisanal and small-scale mining, as we've just heard previously. And that is why much of our work with Fairphone in the impact facility does focus at the moment on small-scale mining, but it is a general principle. So the vision really for me is this, we're about to see this huge growth, as we've heard, of mining and minerals demand supply over the next decade. The World Bank talks about 500% productivity increase for some minerals. Imagine then we are to invest into these mining communities, into these mineral development communities with relatively modest amounts of money into small and medium-sized businesses, including small-scale mines. We can build an economy that will persist way beyond the life of the mine. And then we'll be leaving a positive legacy from our demand for metals, rather than see it as minimizing negative aspects of something that we can't avoid. But this isn't happening, or at least it's not happening at scale. The reasons for that we can go into at a later date. But what we've done to fill that gap starts the impact facility for sustainable mining communities, along with Fairphone and Fair Trade, and with support from companies like Signify, Tesla, Glencore, and a number of others as well. If you go to the next slide. So the impact facility is it's a hybrid non-profit and an impact investment vehicle. And it's established specifically to, on one hand, provide a vehicle for downstream companies to channel their support and investments, and on the other, to work directly with the mining communities. And this slide here really talks to some of the core principles, and really just kind of tease out three here. The first one on the left-hand side of the slide is the idea of continuous improvement, or progressive, in terms of the environmental and social governance standards. And this is really critically important because this is talking about development rather than compliance. So when you're doing compliance and due diligence, what you're looking to find out is whether a certain standard has been met. When you're looking at development, you're looking to facilitate a progressive path to improvement. So this, what we call the escalator, the impact facility escalator, is a core idea about having to lift up small and medium-sized enterprise, and especially ASM. On the right-hand side, we have the three access. Access to technical assistance and capacity, access to fair markets, and access to equipment. So I've been working in development for about 25 years, and most of the work in that time has focused on one or two of these, either access to markets or capacity development, but very few bring these three things together. We have these three things together, the access to capital from investment, plus the access to capacity development and the access to markets. That's when we can enable sustainable small businesses to thrive and persist. And then the last kind of principle applied in the impact facility is the convening of the supply chain, because we believe very strongly that these development issues that have been highlighted in the previous remarks aren't the responsibility of any one company, certainly, or any one tier in the supply chain or any one sector, but instead, if we are going to solve these and solve them systemically, we've got to kind of all pull together. So next slide. In the last slide, not sure how much time I got left, but I just got a couple of examples of what the impact facility is doing. So this first one, and Tirza mentioned this earlier, is the Fair Cobalt Alliance, which is convened by the impact facility, but founded by kind of Fairphone and some of those names on the board here. And the core thing here is that we have managed to pull together both the upstream and the downstream to come together to kind of pool resources and ideas for a common purpose, which is for the cobalt, artisanal small-scale mining cobalt communities in the DR Congo. If you go to the next slide too. And then the way we're looking at this in the Congo and the cobalt mining fields there is, again, to look at this systemically. Of course, everyone knows on the line, I'm sure, that the significant issue there has been around child labor, the notoriety of which was raised in the Amnesty report in 2016. But we look at that systemically. So yes, we have part of the program which is looking through the escalator approach to make improvements on those mining sites. And secondly, though, we also look at child labor outside of those mining sites, because we know that the children go onto those mining sites because they have few alternatives. So we also have a part of that program which is looking at the roots of child labor and how we can ensure that they enjoy their childhood and have opportunities to go to school. And third, again, a part of a system is to look to see how we can create alternatives through stimulating entrepreneurialism as well. So that's one project, Cobalt in the DRC. And then a second example, which Tirza also mentioned, was our work in gold in the Lake Victoria Gold Program in Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya. And really the key point I want to say here is this is a program where, and the previous speaker was talking about this, where we have pushed ahead with the focus on impact investing. because that is a key thing which is missing there. How can we provide in a sustainable way these communities with equipment, whether that's gold mercury-free processing equipment or a pump to get the water out of their pits so they can actually get the ore out of the ground, and do that in a way that will leave these as thriving small-scale businesses into the future. And so we've done that rather than just hand out grants. We've enabled grants for capacity development, but we've also set up a leasing operation where the miners can actually lease the equipment from the impact facility and pay that back over time to eventually own that equipment. And by doing this, this has established them as a strong small businesses and also introduces them to the formal financial market so they can be accessing loans in the future. So just my last slide, I think. So just my concluding kind of key messages then is that risk management, of course, due diligence, absolutely important. We have to do it, but it has limits. And if we want to manage supply chain risks, we need to get to the root of the problem and catalyze impact upstream in the communities where we can get to the systemic solutions. And the root of the problems very often do with governance and to poverty, and these are systemic problems which need investment and time, and so investment is, and making investment available is absolutely critical. So mining development, see mining development as an opportunity for economic development, which currently is overlooked and not grasped by the communities who have fewer other choices. If we can grasp this opportunity, then we can leave behind a legacy and at the same time manage the risk that many of these conversations start about. So I hope that at least gives you a glimpse into what we're trying to do. But please do be in touch with us or Fairphone or Fairtrade if you would like to learn more.
Thank you so much, Ashton. I'm going to do a little bit of a juggling exercise, and I'm going to try to combine different questions in one so that we can move on to our next blog as well. I hope Marcus and Shreya are still with us and just patient for your turn. But before we move there, I'll try to combine a little bit. There's a little bit of question for Bauke on alternative jobs for miners. Maybe you can take that one. It specifically says, between quotes, in reference against recycling materials and circularity, wouldn't it be better to find alternative jobs for the miners? I know this is challenging too, instead of supporting an industry that potentially destroys the planet.
Yeah, I can be short on that. Solidaridad and other organizations as well are really working on this. The challenge is that many go into mining because it's their best economic option and an opportunity. We see prices, for example, in Ghana, prices for cocoa are falling. And they're at record low prices, you can say, and contrary to the prices of gold going up and up. So yeah, it's definitely something that we should try to do. That needs attention. But given the record high prices for gold, I think it's not very realistic to think that there will be many other more attractive economic opportunities for people that work in ASM gold mines right now.
Thanks, Bauke. Maybe just a question also for people of the audience that are maybe less aware of the issues that we are talking today. So a little bit more back to basics. If we can, maybe it's also a good question for Monique and Tirsa, if we can mention some of the other materials that are also play a role in these issues and maybe connected to something tangible like components in a phone or something like that. So we've talked about gold, we've talked about cobalt, for example, but how do these materials come into our products?
Should I take that one?
Sure, Monique, thanks.
So your question is how, give some examples of how they enter into our supply chain.
Yeah.
So for example, with cobalt, it's part of our, it flows into our battery supply chain. So therefore we also work closely with our battery vendor to integrate this, the cobalt coming from the 2 mines we scoped under our program of the FCA into our supply chain. For gold, yeah, that flows in actually over, I think it's 15 sub-supply chains, but we've managed to tackle a few of them, including the PCB, for example, integrated circuit board. So that is where, yeah, gold is an important material that connects and that facilitates the electricity flows in these connections. So that's another example. Yeah, we have quite a lot of tin in our solder, for example. So where we set up in the beginning one of the first separate supply chains of tin from Congo that's entered into our solder supply chain, and where later on this was integrated into the broader ITSCI scheme and also the CFS smelter scheme. So these are just a few examples.
Yeah, and we are focusing on 14, but there's more than, I think, 40 different metals in a smartphone.
50, yeah.
And I know a person that is also with us today that knows a lot about all these different materials that come in difficult and complex systems, and gets into these electronics that we all use. And that's definitely Marcus Reuter. Marcus, are you with us? Can you introduce yourself? And the floor is yours for your presentation.
Thanks, Mikael. Ladies and gentlemen, hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah. And if just a reminder that we have around 7-8 minutes per. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure, we got squeezed a bit, but I'll try. The link for myself and my colleague to Fairphone started 2016 when Fairphone approached us to try to understand the full recyclability of their Fairphone 2. They did a quite unusual thing, and I think this is the tenor of this webinar, is open and transparent, being open and transparent. I said, well, we can help you by doing that in a simulation based, using engineering tools which can link the mine to the metal production through to the recycling and back into the metal. Let me just share to you in these 5-6 minutes what we've done. And I'll keep it short, and you'll see some complex pictures, but I purposefully selected these to show the rigor that is required to transparently open up the supply chains and make them clear. So what I'm showing here is really the physics behind the circular economy, and it's actually a downward spiral. And it's not circular, it's downward spiral, and the role we can play, and that is the path that Fairphone is going. How much can we mitigate that? And how much can we mitigate that by modular design, but at the same time being cognizant of the physics of that system? And what is shown here is the circularity linking mine to product, but also showing the dissipative losses, but also the second law entropy exergy dissipation in that system. And I always liken that, and I always say this because I wrote this into the UNOP report on metal recycling a couple of years back. Please think of how to unmix your cup of coffee into its constituents and create a pure cup of coffee again with those constituents. That is circularity. That's true circularity, not just hand waving. And Fairphone went on this path with us. Next sheet, please, to unravel this cup of coffee. Now, unfortunately, the resolution is not that high. You may have come across the metal wheel, which actually tries to show what metal sectors are required to unravel that puzzle. Not only get the materials back, but get them back into a purity that they can go back into the product. Well, that's key. There are companies speaking about recycled content, but then I always say, what is the residue that the recycled content has created to be saying that you've got 100% recycled content? And if you start doing this rigorous type of analysis, which has all been documented, and it's part of engineering and where I'm at the moment in an engineering company, you can get down to these answers. So once again, Fairphone approached us about a year ago, or more than a year ago, to have a look at their Fairphone 3 design. And once again, in a unique open transparency, they provided us with the bill of materials, full material declaration, so we know what materials, and it's not just elements, it's compounds, complex compounds, plastics, fillers, everything together, to understand what is the true loss of the system, the recyclability of it, linking back then to the mine, that you would need a mine, whichever mining activity it is, but you would need to replenish stuff that is lost. Just think of your cup of coffee. To the next sheet, please. So here, I'm just showing this platform as well, not for you to see the detail. You can have a look at the sheets later on, but it actually shows what we've done. We've taken the modules. We've created a flow sheet with over 1,000 streams in it. Just recognize that. That's the detail that Fairphone is going into, to be open and transparent about the supply chain. The many compounds, I won't mention the number, but the many compounds in their products and the materials that are created while you're closing the loop, supposedly, is all part of this. And at the right-hand side, you'll see all the different elements and materials. Next sheet, please. Once again, you'll say, what the heck, at this late time of the day to see the processes. But I just want to share this with you, not to look at the detail. This is just how to smelt the copper bit and get the gold into a phase where you can actually recover it. And this is all economically viable. So this we've done for all their elements, all their compounds in their product. And therefore also being able to quantify the real true loss. Well, let me just make a very poignant statement. How many companies are actually doing that? How many are truly saying what is the true recyclability of their product in a circular economy, closed loop type of approach? Let me show the final sheet in view of time as well. This is what we had come up with my colleague and I in 2017, which Fairphone 2 had a recyclability sort of around the 30 to 40% range, which we tried to make the complexity of true circularity clear by showing it in this form, gleaning from the energy label. And this is where we are now with Fairphone 3. Show me the company out there that is so transparent with its true supply chain. It's metals from mine to product, back into product. That's my 7 minutes, I think, Mikael. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, and thanks for taking us to the world of recycling and metallurgy. Thanks. We'll move on, and then I'm sure there will be a lot of questions about this. So we are getting to our last speaker now with the right picture. I'm sorry for before, Shreya. Are you there with us? Can you introduce yourself, and the floor is yours for your presentation.
Thank you. Yes, I'm still here. Hi, everyone. This is Shreya. I'm a technical officer at the International Labour Organization, and I'll be speaking to you today about the challenges and opportunities related to working conditions in urban mining, specifically related to electronic waste. So I think we can start. Yes, that's just the title. Yes, so like I mentioned, what are we mining in urban mining? Well, I think specifically for this webinar, in this case, it's important to focus on electronic waste. I think we all here know what electronic waste is, so we can move on to the next slide. We generate a lot of it. Tirza has already covered it, and the amount we're generating, of course, is growing quite fast. Actually, I prepared the slide for trading 12 months ago, and now the new number is 53.9 million tons. So it's growing really, really fast. So this is something, you know, it's not only a challenge, but also a huge economic opportunity. Next slide, please. So other panelists have spoken at length about what is inside e-waste and electronic equipment. I won't go into detail with that, but just the main takeaway here is that there are a lot of toxic materials in a lot of the waste electrical and electronic equipment that is in the mix at the moment. Next slide, please. So while it is quite toxic, there is also a lot of economic value within e-waste. Last year it was estimated that there was about 55 billion euros worth of value in electronic waste, but a lot of it is not actually being recovered. And naturally, because there is a lot of value in e-waste, there's millions of livelihoods that are dependent on this e-waste economy. Next slide, please. So what I have in front of you is a very simple urban mining value chain. Before going into the challenges, it is first important to understand who exactly is it that is working with electronic waste. In a lot of developed countries with established formal e-waste management systems, it is quite a straightforward value chain. You know, the e-waste is collected, then sorted, and then it is processed. However, in a lot of developing countries where there's almost an interaction between these two coexisting systems of informal and formal value chains, it gets a bit more complicated, where informal and formal collectors are interacting with informal refurbishers informally refurbishing products that they do not have the license or the correct equipment to do so. And in many places, for example, in the African continent, 90% of the electronic waste is being managed in the informal sector. That being said, we are not recovering a lot of the value in e-waste because a lot of these processes are quite rudimentary. And next slide, please. So as I mentioned, a lot of people are engaged in e-waste management. However, since a lot of it is informal, we don't really have an idea of just how many jobs this economy is providing. We have some general estimates. For example, 19 to 24 million people are engaged in waste management in general. We know that about 1 million people in China are working with e-waste. Over 100,000 in Nigeria are working with e-waste. But to date, we don't really have an exact number of how many people are really working in this space. Next slide, please. But also, in addition to not knowing how many people are in this space, there's also a lot of safety and health concerns related to the informal economy. For example, the photograph that you see on the bottom left, this is a photograph from Nigeria of a home-based semi-formal refurbisher. And they're using a lot of rudimentary equipment to refurbish. You can see a lack of ventilation, and studies have shown this can lead to higher levels of lead in blood and can subsequently lead to a lot of health and safety risks. The photo on the top right is a dump near New Delhi, and not only is this an unsafe environment for those working, but it is also an unsafe environment for those that live around. For example, you can see children playing in this area as well. So you get the picture of what informal e-waste management generally looks like. Next slide, please. So in general, what are the challenges here? As I mentioned, high levels of informality, which means uncertainty regarding wages, lack of access to social protection. It's outside the purview of labor inspection, so it cannot be regulated. Also related to that is poor, unsafe, and unhealthy working conditions, lack of access to PPE. There have also been instances of child labor that have been found in e-waste management. Also issues related to discrimination, since in a lot of countries, there's a lot of social stigma associated with it. But at the same time, there's a huge opportunity with e-waste creating jobs in lead reprocessing and reprocessing of other secondary materials alone. The ILO has predicted that the increase in jobs might be by 12 to 15% by 2030 alone. There's also a huge opportunity for the creation of sustainable enterprises that are offering innovative solutions for collection and recycling of e-waste. Next slide, please. So are there any solutions? What has been done so far? The ILO has taken a huge step in promoting decent work in the management of e-waste. In April 2019, we had a global dialogue forum where we gathered governments, workers and employers organizations from all over the world to shed light on what their challenges are in the space, and then together come to a conclusion and adopt points on what can be the way forward to ensure decent work for all in e-waste management. Next slide. I'd like to share a few points that were adopted from this meeting that can perhaps provide some guidance on what the next steps can be here. One is investing in waste management infrastructure at all levels. Another one, which is really important, is ensuring that everyone is covered by labor standards. And very important also is effective social dialogue. And a lot of the times when we're talking about circular electronics, moving towards circularity, it is workers, organizations are often not included in the conversation. Employers' organizations are not always included. So it is important to include those with most at stake into this conversation. Next slide, please. Also, just simple steps to for the way forward to collaborate and work together on collecting data, such as in employment, understanding the effects, decent work challenges in the e-waste value chain, taking steps to formalize the existing informal networks. So one thing to point out here is that when we move towards circularity, instead of creating a whole new formal system and abandoning those in the informal, those millions of livelihoods, we can actually capitalize on the knowledge that is already there in those informal and formalize those. Also access to financing and other support that can be given to innovative enterprises. Next slide, please. I know all of this sounds very general. So to end, I would like to share just two examples of work that has already been done that might be of interest to you. For example, in Nigeria, a medium-sized enterprise was set up to recycle electronic waste. And what they decided to do was hire informal collector and formalizing them, but also in a way connecting that enterprise to the existing network. And the result of this was, I think about 500 informal collectors had access to better wages, social security, training, but also this also showed that it improved access to education for their children as well. So kind of a ripple effect here. Another partnership was with Seva, a cooperative in India, GIZ and Microsoft, who focus on training women in dismantling e-waste educate them not just about e-waste, but how pricing works, connecting them to the informal sector, and just also increasing awareness about this issue in India. So I leave you with this. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak here.
Thank you, Shreya. Very, very interesting. So we've given you a view of materials from the beginning until the end and all their effects. I'm going to close off with two more questions. Apologies, we are a little bit over time, but I think conversations and presentations are so interesting. There is a question for Marcus. If you can give us, you have such much experience working with different products and different industries. What would be, can you give us a couple of examples of what would be the average of recyclability of other products, for example? So we talked about Fairphone, that's between 30 and 40, 50%. What about the car, for example, or other products that you could give an example about?
You know, can I answer that in the context of mining?
Sure.
If you want to understand what a mine yields, you need to know its full mineralogy. You have to know the ore body. You need to know what losses you'll create to understand how much you'll ultimately recover, and then in the whole supply chain. So I never want to answer those questions because ultimately the complexity of a product determines that. So if the classical design, modular design examples are one or two, say 3 mono materials, which you can take apart and put into different dumps and you get the materials back. But depends on the complexity and how things are functionally linked as not elements, but compounds, alloys. That determines that ultimate number. And I'm just speaking about materials here in the engineering sense. You have 100 units coming out. Where do they go? I'm not speaking about legal and all the legislation that says other stuff. I'm speaking on the basis of physics and what is possible. And that's also reflected by economics.
Yeah.
I want to answer that question because if I have the full bill of materials and its connections and what is linked to what, then you can answer that question. The tools are there to do that, like we've been using for many years in the mining and metals industry.
Yeah.
Linking that to the product, then I can answer that well. So I'm not going to answer that because
that's probably the best answer. That
I
it
don't
is
want
complex.
to do that.
And you've shown how complex it is, and that it's really important to look at every material and every part.
Sure.
So thank you for that. I'll close. There's one question for Shreya from Amitra. Could you point out some guidelines for like small lab-like setups where may not be recycling, but still are ready to set up processes to keep the waste safely in their premises? So I guess for less professional setups. Can you point out to some resources that maybe you have, or maybe we can share later with the audience?
Thank you very much for raising this question. Actually, the ILO has a methodology that specifically focuses on small enterprises for semi-formal home-based workers. And there is a manual already available in India. I will be happy to share the link. And the idea is that we go to these enterprises and workers, we discuss what their safety and health issues are. And based on those, working with occupational doctors, we develop cost-effective solutions on addressing safety and health in these e-waste workplaces. And we also translate them in a way that these are just easy to understand visuals. So anyone at all levels of education can access this material. So I will be happy to share that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are going to close here. I think there are some pending questions, but I believe they will be answered with the slides that we will share. We will make sure here with the team that we stay to answer the ones that will not be answered. So I would like to close here because we are 20 minutes over time. Thank you for your patience, for everybody to stay here. We still have around 40 people listening, so I'm very happy that that you stayed in. I hope you liked it. We hope that this is not the first one, so that we continue this series of webinars. Hope you learned, and yeah, I'm just going to leave it there. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for all the speakers to be there, and see you next time.